Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on when you may be watching this. I am James Moeller, and this is the Grad Connection, where my whole hope and desire is that these videos would help graduate students better navigate graduate education and therefore really thrive rather than just survive. Appreciate comments and people that have reached out to me on various media relative to these videos, and had a prior student, I guess, that took a research methods course of mine some time ago. And yes, a lot of this is stuff that I used to teach there. Even though some of my thoughts have evolved a little bit in some of the topics, a lot of it remains the same. And so I hope this research series is actually helping graduate students who are watching it in formulating theses, dissertations, and kind of the things related, particularly to, since we're in proposals, particularly related to proposals. But so today's topic is talking about developing research questions. You could also say developing guiding questions. Really kind of the difference between the two. Research questions I would aim more towards, or really direct more towards quantitative types of research. Guiding questions is typically used when we talk about qualitative research, and even though there are questions that kind of guide both or direct both, or are fundamental to each, the words they use and the approach that is used is obviously different. Admittedly, a lot of what I'm going to talk about is kind of with a quantitative bent. Because oftentimes the guiding questions are much looser in qualitative research. They're much more open-ended purposely, because the whole point of qualitative research is try to develop theory as opposed to testing it. So most of this is going to be related to quantitative. I will also say I have a bent that's more towards non-things and stuff than, and when I say things and stuff, it's people that do research relative to apparatus or software, hardware, or whatever, in which you basically test it under certain conditions to see if it does something at some level. So relative to research questions, to me, the most important thing that you do as a researcher is you're beginning to, whether you're focusing on thesis, dissertation, or whether you're doing anything else, is really kind of focusing on that research question. Because to me, that research question drives pretty much everything else. And so usually when I would work with graduate students in developing a proposal or a research idea, a lot of times whether something is going to be included or not included really depends upon the research question. So to me, that's, aside from like a scope section that kind of further narrows, to me, the most important thing is the research question itself. Oftentimes when I would teach this topic, I would refer to a line from the movie The Patriot. If you ever saw that movie, there's a line in there where Mel Gibson asks his boys if they remember what he taught them about shooting, and it's basically, the line is aim small, miss small. And this actually, if you kind of study this out, essentially the folks that were helping both Mel Gibson and Heath Ledger, as well as others, to kind of learn to shoot muskets, one of the things that they focused on is kind of a really common principle in shooting types of sports, which is, if you aim for a large target downrange, and you miss. For example, if I were to aim for the body of an individual relative to the movie The Patriot, and to miss, I would miss the entire person, as opposed to if I were to aim small and, like, for example, focus on a button or a badge or something that's on the individual, a very tight, small area. Even if I miss that button, even if I miss that mark, essentially I still hit the larger target. And so the idea here is I like to use that as an example relative to research questions, because in my mind, you want to aim small, miss small. You don't want your questions to be too vague, too general, too broad, and those kinds of things. And it's usually, my experience has been, it's working with graduate students in developing research questions. It's not often, it's more often the case that the question is too vague or too broad or too big than it is for it to be too small or too specific. So, but that's the concept of aim small, miss small. I've already kind of talked about, the idea of research questions versus guiding questions. I've done both quant and qual, trained in both. And they kind of serve different functions. It's kind of like in quantitative research, you're trying to define as much as is possible up front. And so specificity in the question is the first thing. Hypotheses follow that, typically then scope and significance sections, and so on and so forth, which we'll talk about. In qualitative research, you kind of have this general general area they're focusing on, and you have guiding questions, and it's intended to be broad. It's intended to be open-ended because you allow the data to speak for themselves as you start through the research rather than coming in with a prescripted idea in mind. So they serve different purposes. So as I talk about this, it's really going to be most applicable to research questions proper as it relates to like quantitative research. Let me talk for a minute about kind of arriving at the questions. So first and foremost, the research question you may be working with as a graduate student is going to be first dictated by the type of faculty member that you're working with. And I think I've talked about this in one of my videos, but I'll quickly summarize that you have two general types of faculty out there. You have a faculty who will say, okay, here is the research question you are going to do. And that directedness is typically because that's where your funding is, or there's some motivating factor as to why you need to focus in there. And it's almost often related to funding. The other type of faculty member is one who says, okay, what's your general area of interest? Where are the gaps in the literature and those kinds of things? And kinds of coaches you, rather than prescribing the question, they allow you to discover the question. So first and foremost is kind of have so I would say for you, those of you who may be you may have a faculty member who's dictating the question, or at least there's some level of specificity. It's not just totally open-ended where you can choose whatever you want to do. There's probably still going to be some work to do on that question. It may not be totally, there may be some refining, but it's going to be less than if you're using the more of this discovery approach. Another approach that some faculty members use, a lot of times faculty will keep like a diary or a journal of thoughts. Oftentimes they come out of as you're reading research journals, as you're reading conference proceedings, as you're even mulling over, various types of work that you do throughout the day. Oftentimes faculty may keep what I'd call an idea book, for lack of a better term. And so some faculty may give you that idea book and say, hey, here's what you need. You pick something out of this idea book that you want to focus on. And so in that way, they direct your work. But ultimately, one of the things, particularly if you're in the discovery end of things, what I mean by that is your faculty member says, okay, what would you like to research within some broad general topic area? And then they try to nudge you towards, or try to help coach you towards, a solid research question. A couple things that I want to say about developing research questions in that context is, first of all, typically research questions are trying to do, you could say, one of three things. There may be more. These are just things that came to my mind. One is to fill a gap that exists in the literature. In other words, it's a problem or it's an area that hasn't been focused on, that kind of thing. And actually, I'm going to say there's four. I'm going to write one down here. But to fill a gap, right? So in other words, you're looking through the literature and you see that nobody has focused on this, or nobody's tried to extend this to do that kind of thing, where you're trying to fill a gap. Second is to try to maybe make a connection between disparate areas. And so me being from a technology area, oftentimes that's what we do, is we're actually merging together or marrying together or bringing together multiple types of disparate things in which we're trying to create a novel solution or a unique solution or something new to create a new connection. Now, the one that just popped up to me is also just very practical to solve a problem. Now, you could arguably say that all of these things are to solve a problem, but sometimes it's a very practical, in-your-face kind of thing. And oftentimes the type of research that I have supervised and have done is really aimed at more of kind of an industrial business approach, where it is really trying to solve a specific problem. Another type of research study would be one to replicate an existing work. Now, I will say for most theses and dissertations, that's not something that typically you're being asked to create something that's a unique contribution or adds to your discipline or field, and ultimately that's what we want all of this to do. But usually most theses and dissertations are not replication studies. And there's not a lot, oftentimes there's not a lot of reward for doing replication studies, because you can have some challenges getting it published, certainly getting it funded, all those kinds of things can be challenged. But in all of these, ultimately the whole thing, at least for the graduate student, is to find something that's going to contribute something to the field or to humanity. Something else I oftentimes talk about, and again, this is kind of driven by your faculty, but at least in my perspective, the thesis or dissertation shouldn't be, you trying to do your life's work in that, right? In that you'll be there forever. really the thesis or dissertation is for you to hopefully make a contribution to your field that's, an affirming or, to find a positive effect, to find something that works, to find something like that. But sometimes it's also finding things that don't work. And more often than not, I think graduate students find things that don't work. Researchers do too, even though they oftentimes don't talk about those things because they're often perceived as failures or as things that, are a dead end or whatever. But what I would say to the graduate student is, relative to your thesis and dissertation, don't try to do your life's work in your thesis or dissertation. The thesis and dissertation is supposed to demonstrate the fact that you can do independent research. It's not about you being able to do independent research that has a positive effect or changes the world or wins a Nobel Prize or whatever the case may be. Now, if those things happen, great. But that's not the aim of the thesis or dissertation. All right. So those are some thoughts that arrive into the question. Now, some challenges that I think exist for developing good research questions. And there's a lot of, if you were to do just a quick search on Google, you'll find tons and tons of research, tons and tons of sources that talk about various things about developing research questions and, checklists and all these kinds of things. And you could basically get lost in the weeds, in my opinion. So I kind of narrowed this down to 5 or 6 things that I think are the most important. First of all, the research question, you have to have a balance between specificity, of it being specific, but also broad enough. And I will say, in my work over 10 years working with students in a research methods course, more often than not, I would say 90% of the time, questions are too broad or vague as opposed to too specific. Oftentimes you can oftentimes tell that a question is too specific is if you have to, in reciting it, if you have to do it more than one breath, it's probably too specific and too long. And so there's this balance between specificity and broadness. I would say it would probably be it would be better to err on the side of specificity and have to back out of it than it would be to be on broadness and have to lean into it. Because you can always back off if you're too deep, if you're too specific. Second is the acknowledgement of the importance of words. And so, one of the things as I talk about this is just to acknowledge that oftentimes the words in the research question do a couple things. First of all, they certainly tell you whether they're quant or qual. So let me give you an example. So if we just use the basic 6, who, what, where, when, why, and how, right? Typically, it's very typical, not always, but it's very typical for questions that start with what to be a quantitative oriented question. Questions that start with why or how are oftentimes qualitative. And then I would say questions that relate to who, where, and when, those are usually context. And they're usually, so I would say my experience with most of the questions that I work with or with students that I work with, they're usually using what, why, and how. That's not to say that there aren't other words that you can use as well. So you could use does or can and those kinds of things, right? But oftentimes we try to frame research questions in that way. Now, I will say I am in the STEM end of things. So if you were in a more of a liberal arts end of things, this might be a little bit different, but typically you do try to frame your questions in this way. So let me give you a couple of examples. So using the word what. So I just wrote down a couple, typical quantitative sounding or oriented questions. So what is the effect of A on B? What is the effect of dieting on weight loss? Stupid question, but you get the point. And typically when you talk about what is the effect, you're usually talking about hypothesis testing of some sort relative to, trying to figure out basically the direction of relationship, is can a certain amount of B be predicted by A? Is the question, and that's talking in like statistical terms, or at least in the vernacular generic. So a second question would be, what is the relationship between A and B? So at least in a quantitative sense, there we're typically talking about correlation, right? Trying to figure out. And so I would argue that oftentimes, if you're wanting to work in a quantitative space, oftentimes you have to figure out, first ask the question, has it been shown that there is a relationship between A and B before I can actually figure out whether there's, what the effect or the direction of the effect is. And so there are steps as it relates to this in a quantitative realm. Now, just to throw another example in there, so you could, I said you could use the word does. So does A change the effect of B on C? All of these are kind of examples of quant, and there's no way that I can summarize all the different variations and nuances that could be in research questions, but I'm trying to kind of give a general. So that's kind of more of a qual orientation would be, why did this happen? Or why did group X do this? Or how does this group perceive X? So those are more of why and how kinds of questions, which are typically qualitative, but not always. And then if we want to talk about kind of another category of research, what I call things and stuff, which I've already kind of given you another video, I talked more in depth, but I gave you just a quick run of it at the beginning of this video. But an example of a question for that was, can this be built? Can an algorithm be built that generates that parses text 70% faster than the current technologies or something? I would say one of the important things in a research question with things and stuff is to make sure that you specify the conditions, and you can specify conditions in other ways other than the question. So, and we'll talk about that later when we talk about scope and significance. And the other is to actually, when you're doing things and stuff, make sure that you provide some threshold that you're trying to meet. And again, when we talk about methodology, we'll talk about that in a little more depth. So word choices are important. And I've tried to give you some examples here. These are not absolutes. Number 3, in my opinion, your research question needs to roll off your tongue. And I've already said, if it takes more than one breath to state your research question, number 1, it's probably too long and too specific. And so you typically, my dissertation research is in spatial ability. And so my research question is how do students perceive spatial problems when they're presented to them, and you'll see that kind of, and now I will say that my research relative to that was qualitative, right? So it was more of a guiding question. But nevertheless, you get the sense that it needs to roll off your tongue, and hopefully it can be easily specified that way. Number 4 would be making sure that it's understandable and measurable. So first, understandable, I would say making sure that it's understandable, obviously understandable to your technical community, but hopefully it can also be understandable to a non-technical community as well. So my implication here is to try to not use jargon if you can. Now, I realize that in a lot of like life science research or chemistry research or even engineering research, a lot of times the research you have to use the jargon because, it's part of it. I would encourage, if you have any acronyms, is to make sure that you spell those acronyms out in that research question, as well as in any title. Those are the 2 most important places, I think, because oftentimes we get so immersed in our community, we forget to spell out the acronyms that we are using, and we start. I know the university that I'm at Purdue, this is endemic, right? This is like everything has an acronym, and particularly for newcomers to our university, and this is probably true at other universities too. So I would just encourage you to spell out acronyms, try to avoid jargon if you can, but I understand there are times that it's unavoidable. And then also making sure that it's measurable. So whatever question oftentimes when I'm working with students and the question is too broad, it becomes evident in the fact that there's no indication of it as to how this can be measured, or it may actually be a question that can't even be measured. And I would argue that if you have a research question that is impossible to measure, you're setting yourself up for failure. That you have to have some way to measure it. And so you have to figure out how to, 1, do that. Number 2, then word it in your research question so that it becomes apparent, because you may not be able to provide all the details, obviously, in the research question as to how you're going to measure it, but at least you can allude to that in the question. And then the last thing that I would say relative to question is you have to wrestle with the idea of is one question sufficient, or do you need sub-questions? Now, one of the things that I typically, when I'm working with various types of graduate students, if you're a master's student and you're doing what I would call a monolithic traditional dissertation, where you have basically one set of research questions, the dissertation is a product, and then you're going to publish afterwards. In other words, each chapter is not So if you have a monolithic dissertation versus an article-based dissertation, essentially in an article-based dissertation, each chapter is like its own little study, as opposed to a monolithic, you have one study throughout. But one of the things that I suggest for master's students, particularly in the monolithic realm, because they don't typically do the article-based dissertation as well, or article-based thesis in most cases. One of the things I argue for master's thesis is just focus on one question. Don't have a bunch of sub-questions. If you're a PhD student doing a monolithic, you're probably going to have one major question. You may have two major questions with some sub-questions, right? In my mind, the only difference between a thesis and a dissertation is scope. That is, as the old adage goes, it's piled higher and deeper for PhDs. And so you're actually you're doing similar things. It's just the one is a bigger project. Or it may be multiple projects if you're talking about the article-based dissertations. But relative to a research question, you have to have in mind, do you need sub-questions? And again, I would advise that master students don't do that. In PhDs, you probably will do that. So the reason the research question is important, because after that, at least in the quantitative realm, after that, that basically is going to lead you to the development of hypotheses. And I think I haven't looked at the next topic for this Grad Connection series, but it quite likely will be hypotheses. And so again, that video is going to be particularly germane to quantitative research, because typically in qualitative research, you don't have hypotheses. And so in that next video, I'm going to talk about quantitative hypotheses, particularly null hypotheses development is really what I'm talking about. But I would also say in that I typically, when I talk about this, I usually also talk about just simple if-then statements, which are oftentimes used in things and stuff kinds of research. So next video will be on that. Hopefully this is helpful to you in developing your research question. More than willing to jump online via Zoom, WebEx, Teams, whatever, to meet with you as a graduate student if you're having difficulty kind of narrowing your research question down, or if you just want to pass it by somebody as an X. And what I have found, the research methods course that I taught for about 10 years, I had pretty much all of the disciplines in my college. That was aviation, construction, computing, engineering, mechanical engineering, electrical engineering, manufacturing engineering, and leadership, human resources, that kind of thing. And so everybody took my research methods course. And what I would say is I'm not an expert in all those fields. Computer graphics is my main field. But what I will say is it helped, I think it helped the students, because I was not an expert in their field, to be able to ask them kind of novice questions to help them refine their research questions and their research as a whole. So what I would say to you as a viewer of this video, whether it's me or someone else, I would encourage you every opportunity you have to talk with mother, brother, sister, aunt, uncle, cousin, particularly right now as I'm recording this video. Next week is Thanksgiving break. Provide you a perfect opportunity to talk to a lay audience and try to make them understand or help them understand your research from a lay point of view. And what that will help you do is craft the language that you can use to simplify. And quite honestly, that is oftentimes what needs to happen, is you simply need to speak and write more simply. There is a very good book that I would highly recommend to you, something called The Elements of Style. It's by E.B. White, it's by Stunkel and White. I haven't looked at the book in a while. It's a very thin book, but the primary premise of that book is that your writing will improve the more simply you write. I think oftentimes academics are their own worst enemy, because they try to make their writing too complex, and then it just becomes confusing. Complexity is the enemy of understanding. And so if you can simplify, you can oftentimes communicate more clearly and have much greater impact on your audience. So for whatever reason, I don't know why I ended on that note, but I will end there. Next week's video will be on Actually, let me take that back. I'll try to get a video out next week. I'll just commit that I may not, with it being Thanksgiving week. I would encourage you on any of these breaks that are a holiday week, take the time to get away, relax, rest, take some time off, and kind of recoup, because you can actually gain more ground that way professionally than just work. So with that, let me close down. Thanks for watching. Hopefully you're finding these videos useful. I'd encourage you to subscribe on YouTube, join the private Facebook group, which kind of pick how you want to engage. But I hope you're finding this content useful. Have a great day. Bye-bye.